Hello everyone, thanks for joining me for this video of October for Heritage for All. The topic of today is going to be about museum and education. The title of my communication is Words and Things, Museums' Educational Heritage. Before we start this topic, I recommend you to read my previous article about museums on Heritage for All page, and you can also find there my videos. So museums and education topic is going to be treated here in three parts. The first part is going to be about the collection as the beginning of education and knowledge. The second, the museum as the continuation of a structure of learning and creating knowledge. And finally, the thinking machine, how museums became important to educate societies. The visit to the museum is symbolic, social, normative, and cognitive. The museum is no longer conceived as a demonstrative container that of exhibits, ideas, and narrations, but as a mirror reflecting the changes coming from peers with the evolution of society, with its advancement and its values. Since the 90s, the theme of museum and education has shown a great diversity in points of view and schools integrating the social innovations offered by the digital world in terms of international openness. The world of the current museums shows, moreover, a great heterogeneity of the professions in the field of the museum's education, going beyond the university framework or that of the institutional researchers. Its educational role would be to make people feel through living and experience rather than to learn in the traditional way. According to the most recent studies, the targeted audience show great variety: children, young people, families, visually impaired, etc. And the aim is to reach an even wider audience in order to understand the greater public. In addition, other studies are carried out on the educational workshops, the classes, and the business committees in the museum, as well as on the educational system used in the visit. We also note that the policy of enrichment, the management, and the valorization of the educational collection interests the researchers in matters of educational heritage. The transmission of knowledge within the museum is no longer related to scientific discourse. The museum uses processes from theater, such as the use of sonography, applied to the expography, whose objective is, as on the scene, to awaken emotions in the visitor. Current studies show the importance of emotion in learning, particularly when exchanging information from one person to another during a visit, and how it even plays a bigger role than the content itself, if the content was to be displayed neutrally. There are educational courses offered by the museums intended for both teachers and school children that concern the discovery of museum professions, the functioning of the institution, such as the management of collection, the setup of an exhibition, and the conception of a museum project. For researchers within information and communication science in France, the museum is envisaged as an educational media. For other researchers, for example, those who study museology, the exhibition is conceived as a media that can focus on very specific themes and meet the needs of visitors in order to learn and grow. It is also a question of studying the production method of this type of exposure, ranging from the communication device, text, images, digital tools, to the reception by the public. Museums education also concerns the field of pedagogy, psychology, sociology, and communication, all of which, together with museology, helps create a semantic repertoire for the museum. Long before the modern museum, education at the museum went through an evolution of the presentation of its collection, from the cabinet of curiosity to the princely gallery, to arrive at the contemporary museum where the collections were the primary source of learning. Learning through looking, a look that has been led by sonography modifications over time by a new order and universalist ideology. How is education organized and initiated at the museum? What are the sources? What legacy do we keep from the learning method of the past? The theatrical collection, source of knowledge. The Louvre, the first museum in France known as the Central Museum of Arts, was inaugurated in 1793. It represents from its creation the quintessence of the encyclopedic spirit of its time, and it is a true symbol of the universalist institution now open for all. The collection seized during the French Revolution will therefore be used for the manufacture of the new man, from a concept by the Republic of Enlightenment. The universal educational project, however, did not arouse the admiration of all. In a book entitled Letters to Miranda, published 3 years after the opening of the museum, the art historian and archaeologist Quatremer de Quincy violently rejected the revolutionary ideology as unworthy of the spirit of the Republic of Arts. The author, who already posed the problem of the decontextualization and the restitution of the works in their country of origin, immediately rebelled against the spoliation of the monuments seized in Italy by the Directory and Napoleon Bonaparte in favor of France. For Quatremer, seizing is a product of savagery. To divide is to destroy, he says, as he advocates the return of monuments to their places of production and the promotion of local heritage. Thus, to say that the museum appears with the Revolution is not completely accurate, since there were others well before the creation of the Louvre, such as the Museum of Luxembourg, opened to the public in 1750, and the Museum of Fine Arts and Archaeology of Besançon, that opened in 1694. So the oldest French public collection of art precedes the Revolution by almost a century. It was bequeathed by Jean-Baptiste Boiseau, abbot of Saint-Vincent, to the Benedictines, provided they presented it to the public regularly. Having belonged to Nicolas Pernot de Granvelle, Prime Minister of Charles Quint, and his son, the private collection remained open for all in the Abbey of Saint-Vincent, and so it remained throughout the 18th century. However, the consensus only directs its eyes toward this period to include the birth of modern museum based on rationalism and whose pioneers were Great Britain, Germany, and finally France. The impulse given by the Enlightenment extends the museum to new practices from a pedagogical and patrimonial perspective in a collective way. It is at odds with royal collectionism and the great courts of Europe to become the Enlightenment humanist project, an ideal museum for the education of the citizen. The question of knowledge remains in relation to the ancient ideal, according to Strabo's testimony of a museum consisting of porticos, a conference room, and a vast cenacle bringing the sages of the museum together. There was also the myth of the Library of Alexandria and the education from the Platonic Academy and the search for the truth, the source of the cult of the Muses. From then on, the museum is linked to the arts, to science, and to knowledge, and is conceived as the space of knowledge and transmission. For researchers such as Germain Bazin, the history of the museum from the Hellenic period to the modern museum 2,000 years later materializes the passage from the collection to the museum. But the practice of the collection, specified Roland Scher, does not appear in the Renaissance with the Cabinet of Curiosity. It is actually much earlier in the temples and the churches that the collection started as the treasures gathered by the royals, prefiguring modern collectionism. For Edmond Couchot, the aesthetic feeling begins well before, with the collections of artifacts related to the sacred found in Neanderthal habitats of Europe and Northern Africa. The quest for curiosity, as the collection in essence is, was already 50,000 years ago, according to Couchot, a main source of learning. Popes, cardinals, high prelates, kings, aristocrats, and rich bourgeois all collected books, objects made of gold, ivory, other strange objects, ancient curiosity, and works of art for pleasure and as a demonstration of power. Cabinets of curiosity, studiolos, and private galleries gather all kinds of objects whose sonography is based on a principle of similarities and symbolic links staged by the collector himself. The cabinet represents the universal microcosm, world theater, and the theater of memory. The sonography of the collection is a philosophical representation of the universe of which Giulio Camillo drew the plans. Images projected, studied, organized in sequence, and scenographed as in a theater provides the setting for the creation. The idea of knowledge is manifested in Camillo's visual project in the form of the show, to offer knowledge through images. It is a physical vision materialized from the imaginary world, ideas to matter. It is about building a spectacular knowledge, setting up a network of references via a precise scenography and an orchestrated staging of knowledge. The method of education is a museum theater for transmission into memory. The Cabinet of Curiosities disappeared at the end of the 18th century, although they have strongly inspired contemporary scenography, including the taste of wonder-specific collectionism caused by the juxtaposition of strange objects, exotic or heterogeneous. However, the collectionism does not guarantee the patrimonialization of the collected objects. This is how the cabinet will give way to a new, more pedagogical model, originating in Oxford at the end of the 17th century with the creation of the Ashmolean Museum around the collections of Lord Tradescant and then Elias Ashmole, bequeathed to the University of the city in 1677. The museum is immediately associated with the science and the creation of a course in natural history as a continuation of the Thoughts on Nature by Francis Bacon. The course was then entrusted to Dr. Robert Plot, the first guard of the museum and member of the Royal Society founded in the 17th century. The institution favors experience as a source of knowledge, structured by the museum. The ordinance constitutes the core of the museum with a school and a laboratory. In this perspective, the museum will be constructed as an educational model and will turn to rationalized and regulated scenographic presentations, detailed instruction, descriptions and size of the paintings, and signs that appears on the walls next to the objects, all of which educate in different forms. For the people to see and learn. In France, the museum open to the public, as we pointed out above, is not an invention of the French Revolution. The Museum of Fine Arts and Archaeology in Besançon opened its collection and library to the public in 1694, and visits were organized twice a week on a regular basis. The princely galleries in Europe from the 17th century turned to the progressive presentation, as was the case in Verona concerning the scenography of an epigraphic museum initiated by the Marquis Scipione Maffei, which went from proto-history to the Middle Ages, passing through the languages of the Mediterranean basin. The Franciscan Carlo Lodoli was the first to use this method, around 1730-1750, with the help of a collection he had gathered for the purpose of teaching the art of drawing by stage. The model will inspire many specialists across Europe. Then, the concern for conservation of objects will go hand in hand with that of the diffusion of knowledge as a matter of public responsibility. Earlier in Bologna, the Clementina Academy, founded in 1709, brought the Academy of Science and the Academy of Fine Arts together at the Poggi Palace for the public use of the whole earth. The meeting of the library and the museum marks the history of education forever through the fusion of two sources of knowledge, the words and the things. In Germany, a memorandum written by Leibniz was sent to the Tsar in 1708 with the aim of transforming the Cabinet of Curiosity so as to help the art and the sciences evolve into educational places open to the public. In 1769, the Uffizi Gallery was transferred to the Tuscan Public Administration. Completely reorganized, it was opened to the public a few years later. In 1753, the British Parliament bought the collection and library of Dr. Hans Sloane, giving birth to the future British Museum, defined as a general deposit for public use. We are witnessing a gradual transformation of the order of the collections, breaking away completely from the style of Cabinet of Curiosity. Studying nature will now be done by comparison, classification of species, and for works of art, by school and by chronology. The Baroque aesthetic, whose sonography uses sets and staged composition that arouse emotion and surprise, leaves room for rationality, specialization, and history. According to Principles of Winckelmann, written in his work in 1764, The History of the Art of Antiquity, the recent history of art must be made by its origin, its progression and its evolution, ending with its decadence, its fall and extinction. The collections of painting are organized by school and within each school by chronology. The museum thus forms a depository of the visible history of art. Collections are also used for demonstration as a source of study and dissemination. The aristocrats and the bourgeois form the public in Paris who comes to attend the public courses which take place in Cabinet of Sciences or Natural History. Classes are offered in Valmont de Beaumont from December to April on Thursday and Saturday mornings. In Rouen, the first public school of drawing opens in 1741. Later, artists claim access to the royal collections of the Louvre in order to perfect their art. Fond de Saint-Étienne proposes to clear a space in the Palais du Louvre to present the work of the greatest masters of Europe, works that are part of the king's collection, works unknown to most. The proposal will implement 20 years later by the Encyclopedia of Diderot et d'Alembert. At the Luxembourg Palace, a gallery is open to the public on Wednesday and Saturdays, where many paintings from the royal collections are on display. The experiment was stopped by the closing of the museum in 1779, following the attribution of the palace to the Count of Provence, brother of Louis XVI. Under Louis XVI, the Count d'Angevillers will lead the development of the Louvre to meet the demand of artists, but also in order to realize the future temple of the great men of the nation as well as the monarchy. He enriched the royal collection and had the models of the fortified cities of the Great Gallery of the Louvre transferred to the Invalides to clear the space. The rise of museums formed from the royal collection took place throughout Europe, with opening organized for the public with access to the library. Kassel, Munich, Düsseldorf, Florence, and Vienna all opened the doors of their buildings to any visitor having clean shoes. Finally, the Educational Museum is characterized by informative cartel illustrated by a representative object. It is not a question of presenting at random, but with a specific order selected by experts by their value for the purpose of exposing them to the public in order to educate the people. The Revolutionary Museum laid the foundations of modern museology. Collective responsibility for heritage, the importance of the role of public authorities, conservation, and its educational role. Unlike the museum that preceded the revolutionary museum context, the Republican state now appropriates the property of the royal family, the aristocracy, and the church to give it to the nation in a universalist design. Mirabeau poses the problem of the status of ecclesiastical goods, objects of worship, decontextualized of their religious framework and their symbolic power. Would they thus become works of art? The Museum of French Monuments, founded by Alexandre Lenoir in 1791, is an asylum for monuments saved from vandalism. He uses the staging for each room he decides to dedicate to a particular century in the history of France, each with a sonography corresponding to its time, playing with the progression of the light, from the darkest to the most luminous, thus the chronological progression, room by room. He presents the artistic style of the period. The teaching goes through the lessons of art and history at the same time as in the gallery of the illustrious of the Revolution, but also by a didactic organization divided into four major areas: art, history, natural sciences, and techniques. It was at this time that Quatremère de Quincy rebelled against the plundering of the arts of Rome in the letters to Miranda, judging it incompatible with the ideals of the Republic of Arts and Freedom. The Enlightenment Museum becomes an accomplice of the largest project built on domination and blood. But it is the Louvre that will serve as a model for many museums in European cities during the 19th century, for the Museum of Art, Natural Sciences, and History, only to end at the turn of the century, giving in to a transformation under the influence of Romanticism and nationalism, with a return to eclecticism and a taste of decorations in museum presentations. Learning, therefore, involves the presentation, the order, the staging of the object, as well as the courses and the access to the collections, to study and apprehend them. But education is also a matter of architecture. The 19th century, the museum's booming age, is also that of the temple museums, highlighting the treasure of archaeology, but remaining faithful to the encyclopedic project. The Greek temple, the dome of the Roman Pantheon, and Palladius villas are models of museum architecture, particularly popular in England, Germany, and the US. This type of architecture energizes the presentation by highlighting the antiques and the sculpture to promote the spiritual formation of the nation through the contemplation of beauty. From the second half of the century, the universal exhibitions participated in the education of the people and revealed the social utility of museum by uniting art and industry. Thus, the learning process of applied art museums and drawing schools helped to perfect industrial productions. Then the museum puts itself at the service of the popularization, especially in the last quarter of the century in France, by adopting the policy of education of the Republic. The ministerial document of 1881 concerning the reorganization of the museum was the same as for the school. It aimed to moralize by the education, charm by arts, enrich by the sciences. Education goes hand in hand with the museum. Although initiated from the collectionism, it quickly opened to the world, unveiling its treasures. Initially reserved for the privileged, to later open to the greater numbers, the collection's objective was to understand the universe and the nature which surrounded it. The collections were the source of curiosity and knowledge that spread throughout Europe in an order built in the 17th century to culminate in the Encyclopedic Museum of Enlightenment, where didacticism and rationalism prevailed. The scenography of knowledge by object is not new. It is the consequence of the gaze of the philosopher, the kings and sages, in tune with the facts of society and history. The evolution of the profession in museums, the birth of museology, and the use of museography for ideological purposes, and the construction of the real, have all participated in building museum education. UNESCO, ICOM, and ICOFOM have helped to redefine the role of the museum and expand it to meet the challenge of the 20th and 21st century. Great museographers like Georges-Henri Rivière made the museum a center of scientific research. Museums have transformed into centers of culture, where rethinking the learning processes in terms of mediation, space organization, and multidisciplinarities, and entering the digital age where new technology opens the way to augmented reality and artificial intelligence, has become an important part of its function. It is today through the staging that the learning passes. The collection is no longer at the center of museum concerns, as it promotes a playful and transformative experience through narrative and the senses. The museum presentations involve a meta-language, mixing communication and information sciences, semiotics, and marketing applied to the exhibition in order to produce narrative that are attractive to an ever wider audience. Standardized in gallery-type spaces, the works of art are relegated to mere consumer objects that does not say anything. Decontextualized, they have lost their meaning. The loss of value for the educational role of the museum is a result of the postmodern era. That is to say, in tune with the globalization, obeying the markets, and that has pushed science out of the door of the museum in favor of materialistic or financial profit. The universalism of the museum has been transformed into a modern globalism in which education seems relegated to the level of the subjective and the fictional. Thanks for listening.